Hey, everybody, welcome back to Practical Liberty. My name's Henry Bingaman. In the liberty space, we don't have any politicians that pay attention to any of our media spaces, but we do have an outlet at the very least where they could look back and see what they should have been thinking at the time. And that is the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. And today I'm very happy to be talking to Keith Knight, the managing editor. Keith, thanks so much for coming on.
Henry, thank you for having me, sir.
So can you kind of give folks a little bit about your background? Because you haven't always been straight up libertarian. We have like the Clint Russells who are second generation libertarians. And then you have some people in the movement who have been around it forever. But a lot more people tend to have a different belief set and then get converted into kind of liberty thinking. So can you kind of talk about your journey here?
So there are a number of things that originally interested me in politics. It was mainly going up to my parents' house in Sedona when I was super young. They would always talk about the importance of being a Democrat. Democrat is someone who cares about everyone. Republicans are the ones who care about either whites or just the 1%. So when I was met with that case, I said, well, it's pretty crystal clear. Caring about more people is better. I'm obviously a Democrat. So when I was sort of looking at how are elections like ever close? How is it that so many people just only care about, either whites or the 1%? I am so curious what these other people have to say for themselves. So listening to Glenn Beck's show, I was surprised to hear that it has nothing to do with just caring about whites or the 1% nonsense. And Glenn Beck brought up the fact that in Obama's health care bill, referred to as the Affordable Care Act, there's one thing called the Independent Payment Advisory Board. Yes, literally a death panel. But, you can always say, well, even insurance companies can have costs and benefits and can choose to deny coverage, but you can disassociate from insurance companies if they go bad. With government, you can't. There was one aspect of it referred to as the individual mandate, and this required people to buy health insurance, whether they wanted to or not. And when I was faced with this, I said, yeah, people probably should buy health insurance and should exercise and diet and listen to Henry's terrific show on libertarianism and read the Voluntarist Handbook. But just because someone should do something, it doesn't necessarily follow that they should be required to by law and be put in jail if they resist, or be put in jail if they don't chip in. And if they resist, the police technically have the right to shoot them if they resist going to jail because they didn't buy something that allegedly is in their own interest. So at that point, I said, I'm not going to support the Affordable Care Act. And it just took me like 10 years or so to apply this principle consistently to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, educational spending. An important part of this is when you say people should have the right to opt out, you very frequently see that people are only focused on one side of the equation. So we have the state on one side of the equation coercing you to pay, and then on the other side of the equation is the taxpayer who is required to pay for a good or service that they may or may not like. So you might just say, well, what's in the interest of the taxpayer? But also, in the long run, it's worth noting that it even benefits the people who aren't getting your money when they don't get your money involuntarily, because it puts the pressure on them to say, if I don't create a good product or service, I'm not going to get anyone's time. I'm not going to get anyone's money. So it even improves the well-being of the welfare recipients, whether it's Raytheon or whether it's a local, single mom who's on welfare. It even makes them better off in the long run when they can only get resources as a result of doing so in the voluntary sector, where you're exchanging value for value, making mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges. So something like charity is not ever ruled out in a libertarian framework, and that is something that's really important. But once I really understood the difference between harmonizing economic interests and unilateral obligations that the state imposes, I eventually just didn't have double standards for the government. I said, well, if I can't, take people's money by force or regulate their commercial exchanges, how can I delegate that right to Kirsten Sinema or John McCain or Barack Obama? If government gets their rights from the people and the people don't have any of these rights to begin with, well, then all we're saying is that morality applies differently and economics applies differently to this group of people, because it's very common. People will say, well, we need antitrust laws because if we don't, there could be monopolies in the free market. And then they go on for the state to advocate a monopoly on guns, monopoly on compulsory education, monopoly on healthcare, and monopoly on what you can and can't say, whether it's on social media or publishing literature. So in the long run, I basically just dropped the double standard that I had for the state. I realized that progressives did not have a monopoly on compassion. In fact, the state is the least compassionate institution in society.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. I did you come to this belief gradually? Like, I guess who was your biggest like influence in because honestly, there's so many good libertarian writers out there that you can, I have what is it, Anatomy of the State right behind me. There's Rothbard, there's Hoppe. Who do you think had the most impact in kind of evolving your views?
As far as the initial evolution goes, it had to have been Glenn Beck, just because
Really?
I had not heard anything like that before. That was certainly the biggest jump. Once I heard Glenn Beck, and he sort of gave many conservatives, which I was at the time, a green light to question the Bush family. For example, I was open to thinking that there were other alternatives besides Democrat and Republican. And then in 2012, when I was supporting Romney, I went to the Arizona debate and was introduced to Ron Paul's ideas,
Oof,
and
yep.
that was just really what kept me in for the long haul, because all of the Republicans were saying things like, "Well, we're hated for our freedoms." George Bush famously said on September 20th of 2001 that Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate our freedom to vote. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedom of speech and our freedom to disagree with each other. Now, this is so self-serving, and Islam goes back to like 600 AD or something. And it only seems like there was a world war, and that wasn't an Islamic war. You'd think that since 600 AD, we'd be fighting against these people who hate us for our freedom, more or less, or at least in 1776. But it turns out all the research, mostly done by people like Robert Pape and James Feldman, that all of the hatred that the Islamic world had to us, that was really drawing me towards conservatism, keeping people safe, preserving Western civilization, was actually the result of three things. One, support for Israel, even after the atrocities in Lebanon with the Operation Grapes of Wrath, atrocities against the Palestinians as well. The second reason was the decade of bombings that took place under Bill Clinton after the first Iraq war, along with these sanctions that starved a number of Iraqi civilians. And then third, occupying Mecca and Medina, the land of the two sacred mosques in Saudi Arabia, to implement those bombing campaigns. So once I found out about that, I said, it's amazing how all of that was kept from me. So I just believed something for 5 years, and I didn't even know that was the fact that it exists doesn't necessarily make it true. There is tons of research done by people like Scott Horton and Robert Pape that I mentioned that absolutely make the case that that's why groups like Al Qaeda, like the Islamic State, like Hamas, like Palestinian refugees, people like Omar Mateen, the Pulse nightclub murderer of June of 2016, murdered 49 people at the Pulse nightclub, injured 53, and explicitly said, "Tell America to stop collaborating with Russia. They're killing too many women and children in Iraq and Syria." This was lied to by both Democrats and Republicans, who took the social justice approach and said, well, this was an attack on the LGBT community because people hate gays. Complete lie. So the fact that I hadn't even been introduced to that was so humbling, and that I just believed they hated us for our freedoms for so long, that I was so humbled that I was really trigger shy to, take any position, and I was willing to read people like Ron Paul. So I'm watching Ron Paul, and he says, well, one book people should read is Frederick Bastiat's The Law. Came across Bastiat's The Law. Other books related to that are, things like Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, where he mentions the importance of how you can differentiate a good economist from a bad. A good economist is able to see not just the immediate effects of a policy on one group, but the long-term effects of a policy on many other groups, both directly and indirectly, with regards to both the benefits and the costs. So once I was introduced to that worldview, it was just so enlightening that I continued to read. And of course, Rothbard's Anatomy of the State is vitally important. That book really gets to the importance of why good people can disagree about something. So you have a very kind person who's a progressive and a very kind person who's a libertarian and a conservative. And generally, they all want the same thing when it comes to making sure people have income mobility, making sure that people have opportunities and they have access to food, water, healthcare, housing,
Right.
and a safe environment and a clean environment. But when they disagree, it's very often the result of not even knowing what government is. So when they're not able to define their terms, when the progressive says government is the process by which society gets together to achieve certain ends, whereas the private sector is people doing their own thing in a dog eat dog isolationist, individualistic world. That's not even close to being the case. You couldn't make this microphone by yourself, which is privately made. You couldn't write that book by yourself. You didn't chop down the wood
Right.
to make the paper. You didn't make the ink. You just bought it on Amazon with a computer someone else made. We're constantly cooperating. So when progressives define government as us doing things together, well, of course, if you disagree on the foundation of the nature of the state, it makes sense. You disagree about literally everything else. So that's why Rothbard's Anatomy of the State is so vitally important, saying that what makes the state a unique institution is it claims a monopoly right to initiate violence against people on with people it never contracted with on geographical areas that they never acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. That really gets to the heart of what the state is. So coming across things like that, that is just so much more mind blowing than anything I had seen on MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News. That I think just that is really what first attracted me to libertarianism and then kept me.
I think so. I got into libertarianism basically the end of high school. So it was 2003. It was the Iraq War. All that stuff was kicking off. So the first presidential candidate I ever voted for was Michael Badnarik back in 2004 election. And then I got so hyped up when Ron Paul in 2008 became a thing. And then I got so I don't know, just blackpilled almost with the way he was treated and run off the stage and ignored. So I stopped voting a couple years ago, and I loved libertarian principles. I love the philosophy of it, but then you have Joe Jorgensen and Gary Johnson's, and it just didn't seem worth voting to me, at least in the last couple cycles. So I'm curious your perspective. How much does the political process, the current political process, how viable is it as an option for securing freedom? Is it something we should actually think about, or should we mostly, practical liberty is the name of my podcast because this is about what you can do in your own life. So I talk about freelancing. I talk about starting your own businesses, really taking control of your own freedom. What do you see as the role of politics in, potentially securing a more free future?
I definitely see politics as much more of the low time preference way to achieve liberty because it's very beneficial as far as getting people who are relatively interested in ideas. That's where the eyeballs are, that's where the ears are. Getting at least on the stage, I think, is vitally important. And just talking to people randomly about these things, you're not engaged in the selection process of, well, here are the people that are actually, who claim to be interested. So you're dealing with people who are already relatively interested and you're bringing forth solutions, especially when you're right up against a Democrat or Republican. You can actually shed light on how both of their philosophies are either explicitly collectivist and evil and violate so many of the same principles they claim to uphold. Progressives say they believe in equality and want the state to be able to give you orders that you have to obey, and they get to jail you if you don't obey them. Well, can we do that to the state? 2 minutes ago, you wanted us all to be equal. Or they'll say, well, you can't have someone, need a driver's license to vote because that hurts the poor. And, that would just be terrible. The poor wouldn't be able to get a vote once every 4 years between two psychopathic politicians. Well, you know what else hurts the poor? Needing 20 licenses in order to open up the
Right.
business to make the dreams come true. To need an occupational license in the 1950s, about 5% of jobs needed a license. Today, it's up to 22%, according to the Cato Institute. So those are the type of licenses that actually have an effect and actually make people worse off than they otherwise would be. You're not able to get your foot in the door when it comes to having a good job. You're not able to get that on the job experience. Instead, you're pissing your time away at schools So much of that is a wasted opportunity cost. All of that needs to be, well, first of all, privatized. But even more important, even if it was privatized, I think so many private schools even are just so inefficient. It's like they start with a premise. It's like, all right, today is going to be 5 hours. Now let's think of things to talk about. When you want to flip those around completely, you say, here's what's really interesting. Is it going to take 5 minutes or 5 hours to tell the kids or the adults this vitally important information? So, yes, politics, because that's where the ears are, and frankly that's where the power is. It's vitally important if we have people in there at least maybe chipping away at the state in certain very clear instances. You have this piece of trash, Rex Archer, who was the head of the Kansas City Health Department, who ordered his employees, who were more at fault than any of the legislators for actually performing this psychopathy, who they went to a organization that was giving out food to homeless people, and they poured bleach on the food. When asked about this, Rex Archer literally said to the camera, these people didn't have a license to give food to the homeless. So what we do is we disincentivize food consumption by pouring bleach on the food. We make sure it's in front of them, and this scares them away from doing it. So we're actually keeping people safe. So when you hear something like that, you want to say, look, I want to spread the ideas of Bastiat and Spooner, but my God, I would love for there just to be a sheriff, mayor, police chief. I don't know, something, whatever. I haven't gotten into the details. But first of all, arrest this piece of trash, Rex Archer. And then second, decriminalize as many capitalist acts between consenting adults as humanly possible. So yes, that is my view on politics. When it comes to things people can do in their everyday life, one of the things you'll notice is that the state explicitly wants us to have basically no standards for them and extraordinarily high standards for us. If we want the state to abide by the non-aggression principle, this is a huge obligation that we're imposing on them. Oh God, I gotta go around and get money, and maybe I don't get money, and then I can't build the things I want to build, and I can't help you people. Oh, this is so burdensome. But it's not burdensome at all when they have tens of thousands of pages in the Federal Register that regulate every single action of commerce that we're possibly engaged in. That's not an obligation at all. We have an obligation to obey them. They'll say the same thing when it comes to appeasement. They'll say, you can never appease anyone. If you appease someone, you're like that idiot Neville Chamberlain. It's like, okay, well, we didn't like the way the 2020 election went, so we're going to not appease you people, and we're going to go inside the Capitol building without your permission. Well, no, that makes you an evil insurrectionist, and now you're a terrorist. Well, a second ago, I shouldn't appease anyone. So when it comes to what you can do in your everyday life is never be afraid to have standards for the people you interact with, whether it's family members, friends. Be able to have certain criterias and say, if you don't meet this criteria, it's not good enough for me, and I'm going to disassociate with you. All that it's going to take is eventually for the good people in the world to have the institutional power and the popularity, frankly, to say, you know what, politicians, what you're doing is just not good enough in this realm. And maybe it is good enough in certain realms. Maybe the FDA is just a terrific organization, and that's who needs to give us all the food information, even though they explicitly lie about how fat makes you fat and carbs are just something that should be at the bottom of the food pyramid and very high priority. So I just can't think of a solid example. But let's say that roads are the one thing that the state, it's a unique service within economics and within the human race, that to have concrete flattened or tar flattened with paint on it, that can only be done by a group called the state. Well, make sure that they're doing the best job by letting us disassociate with them. So by you just having standards for, what's okay, what's not okay, eventually that is hopefully going to expand into the realm of politics. And I just don't think we should be afraid in general of getting into the political realm, because, as I mentioned, that's where the eyeballs are.
So I guess, what level do you think is the best from a practical level? Like, it's way easier to get on your local school board than it is to, we've seen, you've actually interviewed a couple of presidential candidates, including Cenk Uygur, who's now a presidential candidate. I want to talk about your interviewing later. But is it more practical to get in at the local level and then practice nullification? Tom Woods wrote that great book, Nullification. Or do these big presidential campaigns where you get to have the Ron Paul potential moment, the Giuliani Ron Paul moment was huge for a lot of people. where it just woke them up. So I guess is it all of the above? What's the best way forward, politically speaking, for like the average person?
Well, I'm going to weasel myself out of this and say embrace the division of labor. For example, I would love to have, I guess, mayor, or I don't know if sheriff would be, maybe governor would be the best approach for someone like Justin Amash, a guy who is not too motivating, but more or less is so good on so many of these issues. I can't
Yeah.
imagine he'd be okay with pouring bleach on food for the homeless,
Right.
or confiscating property from people who are practicing business without a license. So that is an example of when you're, dealing more locally. Someone like Justin Amash would be great. When it comes to someone like Tom Woods, Scott Horton, and Dave Smith, I think the bigger the platform that they're on, the better. Just because they are so motivating to listen to. As far as people, I mean, Josh Smith just put out a terrific video on the importance of, hey, pro-lifers, do you stop being pro-life when the child comes out of the womb? Isn't life, from conception to death? Well, then how on earth could you possibly cheer the bombing of innocent kids in Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, Afghanistan, Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki? You were just pro-life 30 seconds ago. What happened to now you're justifying the mass murder of innocent people, not discriminating between the guilty and the innocent? That's the least pro-life message you can have. And Josh is also pro-life. So having great messages like that is vitally important. People like Michael Rechtenwald explaining that the divide in society should not be the rich versus the poor. The example I've used is Black Americans are wealthier than Black Haitians. And those groups, even though there's drastic income inequality between them, they shouldn't have any beef between each other. They should both be rooting for, each other to do well in their respective areas. So what Rechtenwald says is another fake divide is Americans versus Russians. 130 million Russians, 300 million Americans. We should have no reason to hate this group of people. Black versus white, another fake divide. Men versus women, with the things like the fake gender wage gap, which doesn't account for number of hours worked, types of jobs they have, what type of value is created, the amount of experience you have on a job. So all this is totally fake. So what Rechtenwald says is a lesson that he extracts from a essay titled Marxist versus Austrian Class Analysis by Hans Hermann Hoppe, where he says the dividing line in society are people who achieve their ends through mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges, and those who do so coercively, either directly or indirectly, meaning there's bank robbers and then there's people who use the state. Now, if you use the state, whether you're poor and on welfare or you're rich and on welfare, or so whether you're Nancy Pelosi or just someone getting, food stamps or something, that is not justifiable because you're acquiring wealth through a process of threats against innocent people. So that is a true divide that we can actually embrace. And that's why I think Rechtenwald's message is important. That's why I think Josh Smith's is also important. I don't know much about Mr. Oliver. I got the chance to meet him in Memphis, but so I just can't speak to
Yeah.
his case.
He
But
seems perfectly nice, but he seems a little too blue-pilled for the current moment in American history. Just in my take, like
yeah.
he seems like a great dude, but I just don't think he's right for the moment.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've really seen anything of him, which is my fault. I should know a little more. I got some heat for having Josh and Mike on my show without him. And it's my fault because I just have not looked into this. I didn't know he was running. But all the respect in the world to Mr. Oliver. If he wants to come on, I will have him on my show anytime to discuss these issues. So that is an example of how people can both be beneficial at the local and federal level. Federal, much more about messaging, but you could also do some terrific things at the federal level when it comes to increasing freedoms and changing public opinion, getting people to disobey bad laws. Eventually, the price of enforcement to the state just becomes too high, and it could be just as good as nullifying a law. But that's my general view on local versus federal politics.
All right. So you were talking about some divides, and obviously one of the biggest divides in the world right now is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was at a Tom Woods mastermind in Chicago, and it was one of the topics of discussion, obviously, among libertarians. And it's I don't know if you saw Walter Block wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal where he was basically saying Israel should be able to go after the Hamas and do whatever it takes, and any casualties are tragic but understandable. For me, it seems like I don't want to see World War III, and it feels like it could escalate into that very easily right now. So, do you have a take on the current Israeli Palestine conflict, or
Uh,
what's your view of it right now?
Well, yes, Gaza has been under a blockade since 2007 from the Israeli regime. And it's important to differentiate between the Israeli regime, the people actually making these decisions, and the civilian population who are conscripted against their will. Many of them said, not only do I not want to join the military, especially with Benjamin Netanyahu changing the nature of how the Supreme Court operates, I'm just going to dodge the draft, so to speak. There is compulsory service, so I don't think all of them are to blame either. But when you have people in this situation of being under occupation, where there's a blockade, where food, water, medicine, if you read the news, I don't know if it was the defense minister or a spokesperson of the Israeli regime came out and said that they're cutting off power to the Gaza Strip. Well, the fact that they have access to such a thing kind of is an indicator that Gaza isn't just some independent nation. So when it comes to the reality of the roots of this situation, they're a group of people who are under occupation, who are getting bombed. You have things like Operation Cast Lead, leading to 600 civilian deaths in Gaza. You have confiscation of property of people in the West Bank. So yeah, there's no reason we should just pick one side or the other, pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. I certainly wouldn't want to live under Hamas. If you
Yeah.
look at all the other Islamic regimes, they don't exactly embrace the non-aggression principle. So it's not like we should give them a pass either. But it is important to recognize that, just as Indians having their land confiscated from them and then living in some sort of concentration camp, which, going back to the days of Pat Buchanan, he had summarized this
Yeah.
as what the people in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, are in concentration camps. He clarifies, not death camps, but concentration camps, much like the Spanish had in Cuba and like the British had in South Africa, where you're in a very concentrated area. Anything that goes in or out is determined by the federal occupying force that you're subject to. So recognizing that is certainly makes it clear that there isn't just good guys and just bad guys in this situation. But I don't know enough about the specific details. Also, don't know too much about Azerbaijan and Armenia and tons of other conflicts. But you can see they're always throwing new ones at us that
Yeah.
what we always have to care about. I keep forgetting that I have to care about the Kurds. It's like, yes, I care about the Kurds, but at what opportunity cost of focusing on the amount of material? It's like I'm learning tons about this Russia-Ukraine thing, only for them to now focus on Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas.
Well, and there are still starving children in Africa. Like you literally
Yeah.
cannot care about every problem in the world. Or you can care, you should have compassion for it, but you can't
Mhm.
try to solve everything. We just don't have no one has the resources to solve every problem in the world. So it's
Mhm.
one of those things where we have a big army and we keep sticking it in places that seem to blow up in our face. And that's, I guess, my biggest concern is that I sympathize with the Palestinians. I sympathize with these Israelites, Israelis. What do you call them? Anyway, but like the Palestinian children are brainwashed to hate Jews from the time they're born. It's in their education system. Like, this is a very, very difficult problem to solve. And it's one that didn't have to be this way. If you go back to the beginning of the conflict, it was set up this way by the British, really, in the 40s. So I don't know what to do. I just I hope the U.S. can manage to stay out of it and not escalate it. There's always blowback, and it always hurts the innocent more than anyone else. So
Yeah, those are the two principles to be anti-war on. One, the costs of war are extraordinarily high, both monetarily and cost of civilian deaths, as well as civilian injuries, as well as soldiers. It's not just civilians that matter. People will say, "Oh, I support the troops, and the troops are vitally important." Well, so are the troops of other countries. Those are, young kids, just like you have in America, who are risking their lives for things they believe in or things they've been brought up to believe are justified. So even if all the soldiers died, we should still, have some compassion for that situation. So the
Yeah.
second reason, one, the high cost of war, monetary and civilian. And then the second reason is the consequences are so often unforeseen. You don't know that, promise in gosh, I forget when this was, but basically Britain gave, I want to say 1905, Sir Edward Grey had an agreement with the French government that if France and Germany ever went to war, Britain would come in on behalf of France because
Right.
basically Britain or Germany was becoming too much of a powerhouse and becoming a competitor in the region. So when France went to war with Germany, the British ended up coming in under the Treaty of London, guys, which was anyone who violates Belgium neutrality, the British regime has a justification to declare war on them. So Germany violates Belgium neutrality, and Britain does France the great favor of going to war on their behalf. This still led to 1.3 million French deaths in the First World War. In the Second World War, Britain gave Poland a war guarantee and said, "We will keep Poland safe." It was actually not a war guarantee in general. It was only if the National Socialists invaded, because when the Soviets invaded on September 17th, they didn't declare war against the Soviet regime. So once they declared war against National Socialist Germany, it was Neville Chamberlain on September 3rd of 1939. This led to roughly 8 million Polish deaths under the guise of keeping Poland safe. After Poland was subject to Soviet occupation for decades after, they couldn't even get free elections. Winston Churchill, I believe it was at Yalta, said to Joseph Stalin, "We went to war on behalf of Polish independence. 8 million Poles have died. Yes, millions of Poles have died. Can we at least have free elections in Poland?" And Joseph Stalin said, "Free elections, like in British occupied Egypt." This is a summary of what happened at, I believe, Yalta or Tehran by Sean McMeekin in his book Stalin's War. So the costs, even to the smartest, most kind people, the long-term costs of war are so difficult to determine that we should be extremely wary about going into anything like this. I mean, very few people, even though you had people in high places like George Kennan, who were saying that NATO expansion could provoke Russia to invade places like Georgia or Ukraine. Um, it's extremely hard for the average person to realize that what they're supporting, when you give Taiwan a war guarantee, when you give Ukraine a war guarantee, you're not necessarily helping those people at all. Or even when you give Israel a war guarantee for that matter. In fact, it can create far more enemies than it otherwise would.
Yeah, we look back at history and, we think of all these wars as like, oh, World War II was so popular. It was a just war. If you look at it, there was an enormous draft dodging effort in the United States. People hated the war at the time. The desertion rate. So people forget that the Nazis were not that popular. They were elected by a statistical fluke, kind of like the Woodrow Wilson election. We had somebody in there that shouldn't have been in there, and you got the wrong person in. The Nazis had the highest desertion rate of any major history or army in history. People did not, even inside the country, they did not like the Nazis. And yet we had to go over there and we firebombed their cities. It's always innocent people, and people underestimate how unpopular wars are because we glamorize them throughout history. But no war has ever really been that good or that popular. They're always a tragedy, and we should always avoid them at almost whatever cost we can.
Yeah, certainly, and governments are constantly at war with
Yeah.
their civilian population. The civilian population is basically the enemy that has just given in, more or less. Like the goal of war is just to make it so your enemy is not willing to resist you, or doesn't have the willingness or ability
Yeah.
to resist your edicts. So it's not like Putin's goal is necessarily to murder everyone in Ukraine. It's to control what
Right.
happens in Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, or maybe even Kiev. But um, uh, but but the lesson from that is that you should weigh the costs and benefits of war over which regime is it worse to live under, and even if it's a little worse, is it worth risking your life, and how much can you trust these people in the short term or long term? Even if, okay, well, Putin is going to liberate us. Well, there are some tyrannical laws in Russia regarding, how you can practice Christianity and a
Right.
number of other things. There's also military conscription in Russia. So yeah, uh, the costs are extremely high. The outcomes are almost damn near unforeseeable for anyone. So that's why people should be anti-war.
And now we're playing with nukes, so we could literally end
Yeah.
the world over this crap. I want to switch directions a little bit and kind of get some free advice from you, because you've interviewed a few presidential candidates. I have Joshua Smith and Michael Rechtenwald coming on in the next couple of weeks here. So how much preparation? You have very controlled interviews. You always have your questions prepped. You know what you're talking about. You seem to, they're very professional. So how much prep work do you do, and how do you handle when you have one of these presidential kind of, I don't want to say they're a big deal, but they're kind of a big deal candidates coming on your podcast? What's the prep like there, and how do you handle those?
So the prep there is just reading tons of material on history, economics, and philosophy, and then seeing what applies to whoever I want to interview. So I never planned on interviewing Cenk Uygur, but when I heard that he was touring for his new book and his team actually reached out to me, I said, well, I've read so much on a lot of these topics he's talking about. I'd like to go through books that I've already read. And anytime you have a book, make sure you have a lot of things underlined, because when you got a big one like this, Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, which I'm working on a video on, it's hard to reread 900 pages, including footnotes. So making marks on books makes it so you can go back and get the main lessons and come up with questions to really try and make the interview productive. But my whole goal is, once people click, I want them to start learning. So instead of asking people like Josh Smith and Michael Rechtenwald, as president, what would you do regarding this or that? Neither of them are going to win. And they've said that, and they know that. So what my questions were really was, hey, communicate this idea to us and show us you're the better communicator. So the way I did that was saying, what do the American people need to know about lockdowns, Ukraine, China, economic wealth, economic mobility, and all the other topics we discussed. So it just comes as a result of reading a ton of different things, tons of materials, reading the Communist Manifesto, reading works like The Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini, never being afraid to go into enemy territory intellectually, being able to entertain ideas without accepting them is vitally important to introduce you to tons of material. And when you come across someone, you say, all right, what is their specialty? And what is the most productive thing that they could teach the audience? That's my approach when it comes to interviews. In general, doing a lot of reading is probably the most important thing. And sometimes it is very costly as far as opportunity cost goes, because you can read a whole book and not really learn anything. But it's just a matter of looking at books that are really good and books you learn a lot from. Tom Woods' rule is, any book that I, learn something new on each page, I recommend. So you can check out those books. For example, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hoppe. And then looking at his footnotes, those are the people that he references and he thinks are important. Reading those books, reading those articles and those essays, that will really expand your knowledge to the point where you realize what is productive with regard to this person you're interviewing, or anyone else. So doing tons of reading and keeping in mind what is going to be productive for the audience to hear in an evergreen fashion. So we could talk about things that are, just temporary, but when you really, talk about any evergreen topic that reaches back in history and you're able to extract little lessons along the way from a historical analysis, that's what really makes it productive. That's why my discussion with Sheldon Richman on Israel-Palestine, we go from 1896 to 2021. That is still something you can watch today and learn a ton about the issue from. So
I'm curious.
I have to go back and watch that one.
With that Cenk Uygur interview, he said a lot of things that seemed patently absurd to me, and you just, as from a libertarian perspective, you just let him talk, right? You didn't sit there and argue with him. You didn't try to debate him, which is, I think, what the temptation would be for me to go down is like, hang on a second, you just said what? That everybody wants free healthcare, and that healthcare. I mean, he said some things that were ridiculous. How do you kind of keep your cool? I guess not keep your cool. What was the strategy of letting him talk versus debating him?
There are two ways you can approach something like this in general. It's one, I need this person to agree with me. And two, how can I communicate the clarity of my position to the audience and his position to the audience? So you're prioritizing clarity over agreement. And I felt like that would be a much more productive way to have the conversation where I did maybe 1% of the talking in our 90-minute discussion. But with all the feedback I got, some people were mad that I didn't grill them on things. But I just know that on the healthcare issue, we would go in so many circles that I just wanted to say, here is my position on the healthcare issue. When we look at things that the state is involved in the last 50 years, housing, healthcare, schooling, we see a drastic increase in those costs and not a drastic increase in those qualities. But in things that the state stays out of, computers, printers, televisions, microphones, toys, furniture, clothing, we can see an improvement in quality and a drastic decrease in cost and a great benefit for the environment. If you watch Wall Street with Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas's
Yeah.
character, he's this rich guy who has this big brick of a cell phone that none of us would be caught with dead with today. Thankfully, the government wasn't out there helping us and trying to make it free and make it cheaper, as if you could even make it free. It's like saying government funds it is calling it free is literally as dumb as saying, "Oh, why are progressives complaining about military spending? The military's free. Government pays for it. It's just free. What's wrong with a free thing being free?" It's just so dumb and ridiculous. I couldn't really um spend too much time on one issue, but I felt clarifying both of our positions and getting down to the reason. So, for example, he justifies enslavement, which he calls military
Well,
conscription,
yeah, that one got me. I was
and
shocked by that.
that was wild. And he goes, "Well, you want everyone to have to participate, not just some people." And I said, "Well, it's not everyone. Right now, it's just men ages 18 to 26. Would women be included in that?" He goes, "Well, yeah, I guess women would too." And it shows you he hasn't really thought much about
Right.
this, even as a world war is being provoked with Russia, with China, and recently with Iran. Um, so yeah, I just my whole thing was I prioritized the clarity of our positions because I wanted the audience to see that rather than coming to an agreement, which I feel is a bit of a fool's errand. I mean, the guy has like 6.4 billion views on YouTube, according to the Young Turks channel. So it's going to be hard for him to give up something like that. So I just thought coming to a clarifying position on where we stand and why, what the reasons are, would be much more productive for the audience in general.
And what I liked about that interview was you held your ground. You didn't back down when he asked you like, "Well, do you think Israel's in the wrong here too?" You're like, "Yeah, of course, what they're doing is wrong." So it's like you didn't have to back down. You stated your position. I think you actually won more fans than he did in that interview because it's going to come up on everybody's feed. So I think what you handled it perfectly, and I just wanted to compliment you on that interview because I thought that went really well.
Well, thank you. Yes, if you could share that one on social media, that was a really that was a really important moment for me because you do all these interviews with people you sort of already agree with, and you don't know how much you're moving the needle by by me promoting someone like I love Jason Brennan, Chris Freeman, Michael Humer, Brian Kaplan, but those guys agree with us, and we're sort of just fine tuning arguments the audience might already have when they're really able to see a productive conversation between a progressive and a libertarian. That does a heck of a lot more to diminish, the halo of legitimacy that Democrats and Republicans have because you see a genuine disagreement. And I just felt that he didn't have good points. He basically has a worldview that consists of having different standards for one group for no justifiable reason. So everything that comes from that is also going to be illogical. Like if you don't understand, if you have the incorrect idea of gravity or how particles move, everything you believe in physics is going to be wrong. When you have an incomplete understanding of what government is, everything that comes from that is going to be incorrect as well. So yeah, thank you for saying that. I thought clarity was better than agreement when it came to that discussion.
Absolutely. So we've been going for just about an hour here. I want to respect your time. You are the author of the Voluntaryist Handbook, which you can get at the Libertarian Institute or libertarianinstitute.org, right, is the website. And you have another book coming out. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yes, that one is going to be titled Domestic Imperialism 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. The reason I think progressivism is so vitally important to focus on is because, well, so many of the assumptions that progressives have, or the claims are widely embraced by conservatives as well. Things like the need for antitrust laws, the right for the state to regulate commerce, the right for state to control education, the need for the state to be involved in healthcare. And it seems as though they have a monopoly on compassion. And so frequently, objections to progressivism are based on, well, I don't know if thus and so is realistic, as opposed to it's completely immoral and economically inefficient. So I wanted to really get to the root of progressivism. So many of their ideas are embraced by Hollywood, the corporate press, tons of Democrats, tons of Republicans. And so one of the central claims of progressivism is that any disparities in outcomes between groups are proof of discrimination, and that discrimination needs to be rectified by the state initiating violence against peaceful people in society. That is probably the most dangerous thing that progressives believe. And they've done such a good job of convincing people of this mythology that most conservatives also believe it as well. So that's why I wanted to have a book on progressivism, focusing on 9 aspects of why I think it's incorrect.
I'm looking forward to reading that one as well. Where can people follow you online if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
They can find me at AN_capitalist on Twitter, and check out libertarianinstitute.org.
I'll link to all that. Keith, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome, Henry. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Until next time, stay free.